Hello.
Yeah, just go.
Yeah, we're going. Hello, welcome to the Hometown Church Podcast. My name is Jesse. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm joined as always by my co-host, Pastor Deacon Ailes.
Hey, everybody.
Deacon, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. I've got family staying at my house, so it's just like a big happy. There's 10 kids in my house right now.
Wow.
Yep.
Yeah.
Some of them are mine. Some of them are mine.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we had some people stay over at our house as well this weekend, so it was like 5 people, 2 dogs. It was a packed house on the weekend.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
But it's good. It's good to have people. It's good. Good to host people. So
It
it's
is.
fun.
That's a pretty biblical concept there as well. I like it.
I think so.
Great.
Cool. So today we are starting a new series for the podcast. Over the next 8 weeks, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the topic of apologetics.
Yes.
It's really exciting. I'm really pumped for it.
Yes.
Today more and more people are walking away from their faith than ever before. The Pew Research Center found that the number of people who identify as Christians is dropping from about 85% in 1990 to 65% in 2020. A recent Barna study found that 22% of millennials who once identified as Christians no longer do. A further 30% still identify as Christians but aren't connected to a faith community anymore, and 10% of Christian millennials are actually devoted disciples, just 10%. The growing belief in America today is that Christianity is somehow contrary to modern science, it's morally outdated, and overall irrelevant to our lives. And so in this series, we're going to be exploring some of the biggest questions surrounding Christianity and its truth claims. Is our faith something that is grounded in reality, or are we just clinging to blind, naive hope in a world that has moved past the need for religion? That's kind of the big question. And so today we're going to kick off the series by just asking the question of why is apologetics important at all?
Yeah. Well, first of all, those statistics are super sad.
Yeah.
But I'm also impressed that 85% of people in 1990 identified as Christians.
Right.
I think those statistics are part of why it's so important.
Mm-hmm.
I'll talk about what it is a little bit first, and then we'll maybe dive into the why it's so important. But so apologetics, just the concept of apologetics it comes from the Greek word apologia, mm-hmm. which you can understand why apologetics makes sense, and it means just a verbal defense or like a reasoned argument. And in our context, the Christian context, of course, it's talking about the practice of giving defense for the Christian faith, and so we see this in 1 Peter 3:15, where it says, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect," the verse says. And so the apologetics is like the preparation of always being ready mm-hmm. to give an answer. And if Peter says we should do it, we should probably do it.
Yeah.
It can involve, I'm answering objections, clarifying misunderstandings, and then just providing a positive case for why Christianity is true, why it's reasonable to be a Christian. Mm-hmm. The purpose isn't just to defend faith against attacks, but also to share the truth in a loving and compelling way, like Peter says at the end of that verse, and kind of thus inviting others to know Christ. And so the reason it's so important is it helps other people kind of understand the reason for why we believe what we believe. But I think possibly what's even more important, and this is just my opinion, is that it helps believers to understand why they believe what they believe, and it strengthens their faith. My wife, Roseanne, and I were watching this Right Now Media thing from Chip Ingram, like everybody's favorite guy on KTIS like 10 years ago, whatever. And he was doing this little apologetics series, and he just opened with the fact that he said some statistics, but then he said, most believers don't even understand why they believe what they believe. There's no reason to them other than, hey, they've just believed this thing. Or so that if somebody asks them a difficult question, well, suddenly they shrink back, or they start questioning or doubting their beliefs, or those kinds of things. And so, that's terrifying. That's bad. Mm-hmm. Jesus himself provided reasons for belief in him. We see that in John 14:11 when he says, "Hey, believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me," or at least believe in the evidence of the works themselves. So he's even Jesus lays the groundwork in saying, like, hey, there's a reason for it. faith, that trust covers the places to where we just can't go, but there's a ton of logical evidence out there for being a Christian. Another thing is just answering doubts. Believers face doubts. I have faced doubts at times, maybe in a certain thing, maybe just in general over my time of being a Christian. And apologetics lays the foundation to kind of answer or combat those doubts in a way that's really meaningful, in a way that you can kind of internalize and kind of use as armor, really. The shield of faith, those kinds of things. Even Jude, in Jude 1:22 or Jude verse 22, it encourages believers to just be merciful to those who doubt, and I feel like even as we understand apologetics and we can share that with others, really it's a mercy and just kind of saying, hey, here's why you can stand on something a little bit more solid maybe than you have been standing on in the past. Evangelism, of course. Apologetics is huge for evangelism because people want to ask questions either to try to get you to slip up or because they just genuinely, that's a stumbling block for them. And so apologetics helps us to kind of understand and work through some of those things to maybe help someone go through the mental kind of gymnastics of trying to get past some of their own hurdles. So that's really key. That's important. And then cultural relevance. People are just skeptical in general of religion, and that's why people are like, hey, I believe in science. Just to quote Nacho Libre, Esqueleto specifically, he's like, I believe in science. He just says that, and that's much of the world. We just have this concept that, well, because science exists, then faith is outdated. It's not needed anymore, and I think that having a good foundation of apologetics shows you why science actually proves God. And we'll talk about that more. But so there's a cultural relevance there that helps us to speak to our culture in a way that they understand. So this is in 2016, but there was a Barna study that said that 59% of young adults who grew up in the church drop out after reaching adulthood. I would be surprised if that number wasn't higher today, almost 10 years later. One of the top reasons given was that they found faith incompatible with modern scientific understanding. And so apologetics just kind of helps to bridge that gap and help people actually see what's true, Yeah. So what are your thoughts? Why is it so important to you?
Yeah. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there with this idea that it's really more for believers than it is for non-believers. Because I think growing up, the way I would think about it was like, this is our way of convincing people to convert to Christianity. And there's been people who have been convinced by the arguments of apologetics who have converted because of that. And a great number of people have. But really, I see it more of as just a defense for yourself, a shield for yourself to not fall away, to look beyond your own circumstances of why you're trusting in God. So when things get hard, you have something outside of yourself to point to and say, oh yeah, this is something that's trustworthy. I think of the parable of the 4 soils, right? And you think of the hard soil where it falls along the rocks and it springs up right away, it receives it with joy and gladness, and when persecution comes, it gets eaten away and it withers and dies, right? And I just think apologetics is a way of deepening our roots so that doesn't happen, that it's something that we can look to and say, oh yeah, there's actually really good reasons to believe that this is true. Even though right now I don't feel like it's true, I can look outside of myself and say objectively, this scenario is a lot more reasonable than this scenario, or this explanation for the world is a lot more reasonable than this explanation for the world. And I think of even in the Old Testament, how often God is, when talking to his people, he's pointing them back to the Exodus event, right? He's like, remember what I did. Remember the Red Sea. Remember
my salvation.
Yeah, remember this thing that I did for you. And they're just constantly trying to remind him of the good works that God did, the things that they've experienced, right? That are beyond reasonable doubt, that this is the God that saved them. But they're so prone to forget and turn away and fall away from their faith, because that's just the nature of humanity. And so having those things that we can say, yeah, let's point to these things that are rock solid, that we know can kind of ground our faith in reality, is so important. Mm-hmm. But back kind of a little bit to the word apologetics. I remember growing up and hearing that word and having almost like a negative connotation to it, because it reminds me of the word apologize.
Oh yeah.
And so it's just like, with apologize being like being sorry for something, right? And so it's just like, yeah. So I guess I don't, and it's not like a fully formed thought there, but just this idea that like apologetics, are we apologizing for our faith? Are we making excuses for why we think this thing is real? But going back to the Greek word, I'm sure they both stem from the same Greek word, right? Of giving evidence, giving reason for, and grounding this, right? Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah. So are there different types of apologetics that are out there in the world? I mean, there's certainly different methods and those kinds of things. I mean, you don't have to look too far on YouTube to find very different methods for people out doing apologetics and those kinds of things, but talking about things. But are there different types that you're aware of?
So I was reading this article by Scott Roberts, who outlined 4 different types of apologetics. And these are the ways that I've kind of seen apologetics in the past. The first is classical apologetics, and this is kind of like the philosophical arguments, the logical reasoning for why God exists. There's then evidential apologetics, which goes a lot more into like the physical, historical evidences that we point to for proving the different claims of Christianity. Mm-hmm. There's presuppositional apologetics, which is an interesting one, which kind of comes from the idea that every person is presupposing a worldview. Mm-hmm. And so presuppositional apologetics is kind of comes from the basis that you're presupposing that Christianity is true, and does it offer the best worldview? If you've listened to anything from like Justin Pezhao, he does a lot of this kind of stuff, and it's really interesting because he'll have conversations with like non-Christians, and they'll be trying to push into like evidential apologetics, and he's just like goes full on into presuppositional. It's like there is no other worldview that makes sense, and he'll like explain it that way. It can be really frustrating for some people to watch, but I actually like really enjoy it. I think it's like super interesting. And then there's the last one I had never even heard of before I read this one, was fideism, which emphasizes faith over I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right. Fideism, something like that, emphasizes faith over reason. So this is the idea that some things just can't be explained, and that you have to just trust, which on the surface makes me very uncomfortable, and I don't like that. But there are things that we don't understand, we can't explain. Science can't explain it. Logic can't explain it. We just have to trust. But those are the 4 that I kind of found.
I wonder if that last one, I actually have the same things in my notes here, except the last one I have is kind of more in the experiential apologetics, kind of that, it's emphasizing the personal experience of the transformational work of the gospel. And you see that a lot in evangelism, when people are working through like, hey, well, look at what God has done in my life. And many people will take that and say like, well, I mean, the Holy Spirit's done so. I was one way before. I'm different now. I can't explain that. I didn't just choose. I've read other books and have not been changed. I've done other things and have not been changed, but God did something. And again, I think that that's important, but there is a call to reason. There's a call to reason from the Bible that we shouldn't ignore. And so I think it's good. It's really, really good to have that kind of sense of, hey, God's done, like not only is, the evidence for the resurrection compelling, but also God's done something pretty serious in my life that I just can't explain through any natural means. And even just the people that I'm around, I wouldn't be around those people were it not for something weird that God did that I can't explain. And so I think there's some basis for that last one, whether it's fideism or experiential apologetics. But
I feel like that one is way more persuasive on a personal level for an individual person. Like, this is the one that made me a Christian.
Yeah.
It's because of my experience. The other ones are kind of like for other people, but also like grounding me when my experience starts to change.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that there's a lot to be said about how these other types of apologetics, or just maybe the larger point of apologetics is almost to, hey, now you're saved. Let's dive into firming up those foundations and those kinds of things. I think it's a lot of, some people definitely do, like Lee Strobel. We can talk more about that, but there's some people who just logically get there and they're like, yeah, I'd be dumb to not be a Christian, you know. But more people, it seems, the norm is someone gets saved, and then maybe they're experiencing some doubt or something like that, so they take the time to research, and then they realize, wow, it's actually pretty reasonable to be a Christian. So, yeah.
Yeah. So what do you think is the leading cause of people leaving their faith today?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think for many people, there is this sense that, hey, my parents went to church. Maybe they weren't even believers. They went to church because that's just what you did. And maybe what they saw at home was different than what they saw at church. And so they just said, I just don't want much to do with that. You know, this is just a series of rules that I think I would be better off without. I wonder if that's a large part of it. But I think there's a number of things. You know, there's intellectual doubts. You know, do I really believe that there's like some, what do they say on like TikTok, Sky Daddy or whatever, that there's just some guy in the sky who is just disapproving of most people. You know, no, that just seems really hard to believe. You know, and then, you know, science, philosophy, historical criticism of the Bible. Like there's these different things. And actually there was a Pew Research Center study that found that many young adults leave Christianity because they just perceive that conflict between like scientific understanding and biblical truths. So there's that. I think that intellectual doubts is a big thing, but then there's just moral and ethical challenges that people have. You know, how can I have this gay friend who I love, and how can I look at that guy and say, well, you're wrong? How could a God be loving and still do that? You know, or again, like how could God punish people who seem to have done nothing wrong? Actually, was it Charles Templeton? I think was a guy who was like, hey, I'm like Billy. He was Billy Graham's friend, and people thought, hey, he's even better than Billy Graham. He's going to go farther. And then I think he went to Africa. I'm so sorry if I'm butchering this story, but he went to Africa, and there was this mother whose child died because of famine. And Charles kind of had this thought, how all that family needed was rain. All they needed was rain for their crops, and that child would have been alive. How could God have it? And so boom, he spiraled down, and Billy and other people tried to reach out to him and help him, but he just spiraled out of control and you know, walked away from the faith. So there's things like that people can struggle with too. You know, how could God allow those things to happen? I think that there's reasonable understandings, reasonable explanations, even through Scripture, to understand those things. But I think that's another big one. People like to sleep with who they sleep with when they want to sleep with them, and those kinds of things. You know, and submitting yourself to someone with a moral standard that is higher or different than your own is hard. It's really hard. Relational factors, kind of like I mentioned, and you know, with having that friend who struggles. Or who is homosexual or whatever, that's tough, you know. And then when the church seems to have judgment, or Christianity seems to have judgment on that person, you can think, well, I don't want to do that. It'd be unloving for me to do that. And I think there's just peer pressure. You know, I mean, if you're, say you're in school or at a job, you know, whatever, and you're a person of faith, there's a lot of pressure for you to not be a person of faith in the world today. And if you don't have a firm foundation, like we've been talking about, it'd be pretty easy to get that foundation rocked and have the crows come and the ravens, whatever bird it was, come in and pick the seeds, and suddenly you're done for, So I think that's another thing there too. They're just choked by the cares of the world, choked by the opinions of others, and they walk away because they don't have a firm foundation. Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah. It feels like probably the leading cause would be moral objections to Christianity, disagreements on what is good, the problem of evil and suffering in the world, not wanting to leave behind sin, thinking, well, how could this thing be bad if it brings me joy and pleasure and all those kind of things, or how can a loving God send people to hell? Those kind of questions. I think a big thing too is just biblical illiteracy. That people grow up in the church and they don't learn how to read the Bible, or they only read portions of the Bible, and then they get to adulthood and they're challenged with portions of the Bible that are very challenging, and they go and read these things that they had never been exposed to. I think a lot of stuff in the Old Testament that is very hard to work through, and it paints a very different picture of God than what they were expecting. And instead of pushing through and working through those things, they run in the opposite direction and say, all of this can't be true now because I can't accept this one portion of it.
I definitely think that's true. That I think that the moral and the intellectual ones are probably the biggest ones.
For sure.
It can seem so silly. I'm doing air quotes for those listening. It can seem so silly for people to just think like, how could someone believe that?
Yeah.
How could someone believe that when they generally give no thought to it themselves? No careful thought, anyways.
Yeah. So why do you think so few people spend time developing a defense for their faith?
Yeah. Well, one, it's work. It's work to do that, and I think that it can be hard work. Because like you said, when we're talking about biblical literacy, so someone has to work through how could God wipe out an entire people, including women and children, and still be good? I have to think through that. Either that or I just have to like shelf that and say, let's pretend that doesn't exist.
Lock that away and we'll deal with that when it becomes a way bigger monster.
Yeah. So I think one, it's hard work. It can be hard work. I mean, some stuff, again, like I think the resurrection is probably the biggest, easiest one to be like, hey, man, it's hard to say that didn't happen exactly as the Bible said it happened. But there's other ones that are just not quite as easy, to reconcile. And so it takes mental gymnastics. It takes work to think through some stuff. And when you're not prepared to do that, or when you don't give yourself the time to do that because you're so busy, you're not going to do it, I think, there's just a lack of knowledge. Like people just don't even think to go there. They don't even think to like, oh, maybe I could get there and try to understand why I believe what I believe. Instead people will kind of go to church on Sunday, they'll hear the message, they'll sing to worship, and then they'll leave. And that'll kind of be the thing they do. And they don't even realize, hey, there's more out here that will just stabilize your foundation. That's it's just make it solid rock if you were to put some effort in, if you were to really gain that knowledge. Hosea, well, I won't even go there. Fear of conflict. I think conflict with others, but conflict with yourself. I remember going through GCLI here, Great Commission Leadership Institute, which was replaced recently by the Leadership Development Community. Maybe it's replaced. Anyways, but we would read these articles on certain theological stances, and we'd come and we'd talk about them. And I'm not a big conflict guy. I've mentioned that in messages before. Suddenly someone who I respect and care about had a different opinion on something that I did. It would like rock me. It rocked my my traditionally held beliefs. So I had to really think them through, and there's conflict there. There can be conflict with others. Like, hey, I actually disagree with what you're saying, and here's the reason for why I say that, and you can do that in a loving way. But there's conflict in yourself too, of like, oh no, I've been operating under the wrong frame of thinking for 25 years or whatever, and that's scary, man. That's really scary. Perceived irrelevance. I just think that some people think that faith is kind of this private thing. This is for me, and and so they don't think it should require a defense. They just think this is my activity on Sunday, or they're just intimidated by the challenge of it. And I think that that's probably one of the biggest ones. That they just think like, oh, this is a mountain of work, or reading, or studying, or something like that. I don't like school. I'm done with school now. Why should I do that? So they don't want to engage in discussions surrounding it or those kinds of things. Even though, I think we're encouraged to, especially, Paul encourages Timothy in 2 Timothy 2:15, just rightly handle the word of truth. And I think that's kind of what we're meant to do too. And of course, there's doctrinal stuff there that Paul's implying and talking about too. But I think that in our rightly handling the word of truth, it means to think about it, to study it, to logic it out, which is not a word, or the improper use of the word, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the biggest excuse and also the worst excuse is time.
Yeah.
Like people aren't making time to even read the Bible or spend time in prayer. Mm-hmm. I just finished reading the Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. Yeah. And that was like a big thing in this book, is that
by John Mark Comer.
By John Mark Comer. Yeah, same author. I've read both of his books back to back. And then and it's just this idea that we've become so obsessed with being busy all the time, and just that has become like the idol of this nation. Is just being hurried and busy, and that makes us feel important because we're so busy. And so people aren't making time to just sit down and be quiet and listen to the Lord and read the word. And so then developing a defense for your faith is even more time on top of that. And so if I don't even have time to read the Bible, why would I have time to figure out why the Bible's trustworthy? And then it's just like, come on, dude, you're not that busy. Yeah. Like we have so much time that we just waste and spend doing meaningless things. Like look at your phone. Look at your screen time on your phone. How much time do you spend on your phone every day? Yeah. Just scrolling through social media, watching YouTube videos, doing whatever, when you could spend time praying, when you could spend time reading the word, when you could spend time watching a different YouTube video that explains an apologetics idea. Yeah. There's a ton of YouTubers I watch these days that like will just integrate apologetics ideas in, and that's like I'll just pick up on different things the more I listen to them. And so it's like, well, I could have watched a video on whatever movie just came out, or how good the Vikings are doing this season, and instead I could spend a 10-minute video watching on someone talking about the moral argument for the existence of God, right? Yeah. So I think that's one that I think is very commonly used, but I'm not a big fan of. I think another one that I like that you mentioned was kind of this barrier to entry, kind of like this feeling insufficient, feeling like I'm not intelligent enough to enter into that realm. Like this is for smart people. And that reminded me, I went to I don't even know what it was, honestly. John Shelkoff invited me to it. Yeah. And it was like this kind of apologetics talk with some teens. And there's this guy, Mike Licona. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's big into apologetics and like, especially surrounding like the risen Jesus, the resurrection. And one of the things he said that really stuck with me was that he was like never a smart guy. He was a pretty average student. He didn't do well in school. He didn't really have much drive to do anything, and he got into apologetics, and he feels like, he's like, there's nothing special about me and he's like debating some of like the biggest atheists in the world, by the way, like Bart Ehrman and all these guys. Yeah. And he's like, and he's winning these arguments and he's like, there's nothing special about, I'm not a smart guy. It's just the evidence that God has provided is so rock solid and so accessible that it's like, I can't help but win these arguments, win these debates. And it's like, oh yeah, that's a pretty good point. So I thought that was interesting too.
Yeah. I think the time thing, I wonder also if that's an excuse to not have to deal with some things. We can have some lingering doubts, and of course Satan will really nag at you with those things. And so how do you handle that? Well, you can work through it intellectually and spiritually, or you can be busy and not have to deal with it. And I think that, I wonder if many people are using time and busying themselves and creating a schedule full of hurry just as a means to cope with stuff.
Yeah.
But not actually deal with stuff. Yeah, I wonder.
For sure.
Yeah.
And there's one more that I thought of that kind of came to mind while you're talking too, and that's this. I think just as a Christian culture, the American Christian culture, we've kind of glorified faith in a sense, especially blind faith. Not every circle of Christianity has, but I think there's kind of like this idea that, oh man, I trust so much in God, I don't even need evidence for this thing. Or like, I have so much faith, I don't need to look into this other stuff. And like, I think of like the story of doubting Thomas, right? And like there's this, and how Jesus said, blessed are the people who have not seen and still believe, right? And so there's this idea like, oh man, I don't even have reasons for my faith and I still trust in Jesus. And
super spiritual.
And it's like, yeah, okay, sure. But also the point of that story was that this guy, I mean, he had reasonable doubt here, I'd say.
Yeah.
The claim was that Jesus rose from the dead. That doesn't really happen that often, and he was a little skeptical.
Yeah.
And the point of the story is that God just came and met him where he's at. He gave him the evidence that he needed. He gave him the physical touch that he needed to believe, and he met him where he was at. So I think that there's a little bit of that too. There's almost this battle that we see between faith and evidence. And that kind of leads us into the next question of how would you respond to someone that says that faith and evidence are contradictory?
Yeah, well, I just think I would say that they're not. They're complementary, and you're wrong. No, then I'd storm off. No, just kidding. I think that the Bible actually calls us to a reasonable faith, one that engages our mind as well and considers the evidence. I think let's look at Hebrews 11, the faith chapter, the hall of faith. And it says, now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. So faith isn't just a blind thing, but it's a trust based on what we know about God. It's a trust in that. I mean, you have to kind of reason some things out when you're hearing the gospel, when you're thinking through those things. It's not like this blind spiritual thing, though the Holy Spirit obviously has a huge part in the conversion of a believer, but that's not what we're talking about right now. But it's a trust based on what we know about God, his promises and his faithfulness. There's the Bible calls us to evidence, so again, faith, I almost prefer the word trust rather than faith, because that, again, if you look at like pistis and hypostasis, the Greek words that are generally translated into faith or belief, both of those are talking about a thing kind of in your mind, in your heart, a thing that you believe that your whole life kind of rests around, like that, especially hypostasis. It means literally like a standing under. My whole life is resting on this thing being true, and so I think faith just gets used as this like, I just believe it, but really what faith is it's a trust. So Jesus, this is the thing that you said, and I'm banking on that being true. I'm banking on it. Now, we have lots of reason to bank on it, hey, like all the things we've talked about so far in this episode, but I prefer that word over faith, just personally, and then we have, you referenced it as well, but we have some examples from Jesus to where he's inviting people to believe him even based on the miracles that he's performed, outside of, but then he also rebukes other people to say like, yeah, you saw all this stuff, you're not going to believe it, all that kind of stuff. They're not going to believe even if they see the miracles, but some people he's like, hey, look at the things I've done. Believe, okay? We have evidence from the resurrection. There's just so much evidence, again, that I think works alongside to just shore up the foundation of your faith, of your trust. So they work together really well, I think. And, again, if we look, much of the Bible and the Psalms and a lot of these things, and even Romans talks about how science is evidence for God. You know, we have the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the works of his hands. You know, people are without excuse, right? It talks about from Romans. And so there's just so much there. I think even the Bible saying like, hey, look around you and you'll see that God exists, that he created everything. I mean, and again, there's many people who have gone into, I'm rabbit trailing a little bit, but there's many people who have gone into studying things about the body that maybe didn't even get saved initially, but there were scientists and things like that have looked into things and then had to say, ooh, this is intelligent design. There's no way I can get around thinking that this is intelligent design. And then they get fired, you know, or whatever, because they were at some prestigious, you know, university, and then they got fired. There's a movie by Ben Stein called, why can't I think of what it's called? You know what it's called.
I don't know what it's called. I don't know who Ben Stein is.
Oh man, what is it called? Ben Stein is the dry eyes, get clear eyes guy. Anyways, Roseanne would be kicking me right now since I can't remember what this movie's called, but Expelled. It's called Expelled.
Expelled.
Bam, Expelled is the movie. Did you just pull it up right there?
I just looked it up.
Yeah. Yep.
I've seen the poster for this one. It's the one where he's got the shorts on and he's got the X spray paint. Yeah.
It is so good. And Ben Stein is a Jewish man.
Okay.
He's not a believer, I don't think. And he just goes around, and all these people have come to this conclusion through doing scientific research that there has to be a God. There has to be, or at least some intelligence behind creation. And it is creation. It's not just a random accident. And then those people have been, you know, silenced or fired or something like that. And Expelled. Watch it. It's so good. And then of course Richard Dawkins is on there at one point, and it's really funny. Like it's
good old Richard Dawkins.
Oh man, yeah, so angry. Yeah. Lord save that guy. Yeah. But yeah, what do you think?
Oh yeah. Man, yeah, I think the word that comes to mind is confidence. Is that similar to trust, right? Is that faith is just confidence. Yeah. It's like, how much confidence do you have in God and in the things that he's doing? And confidence is built off of evidence about the things that you see, right? If I drop a ball 100 times, I have faith that it's going to hit the ground every single time. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Why? Because I have sufficient evidence that every single time I've dropped the ball, it has hit the ground because of gravity. Yeah. Right. And it's a similar thing where it's like, if you see the evidence over and over, it's just going to give you more faith. Evidence builds up your faith. It doesn't take away from how much faith you have. Right. But yeah, somehow people get it in their head that these two things are like opposite. Yeah. If you're searching for evidence, then you don't have enough faith. Right. And that's certainly not the case. I mean, faith generally comes first. Right. You know, hey, I trust Jesus that you were God, that you died for my sin. But not all. I mean, a lot of the times in the scriptures, like the times that we see people acting in faith is after they've seen Jesus do something miraculous, right? Yeah. We see Peter walk out on the water after spending how much time seeing Jesus do all these miracle things, right? Because he's like, hey, if you are Jesus, I know that you can command me to walk on this water and I'll walk on it. And then it's after that he starts losing faith because he starts looking around. But yeah. These are big waves. Yeah. Oh boy. Yeah. But he's initially it's just like, yeah, I've seen the things that you can do. I'm confident that if I step out on the water, I'm going to walk because I have good evidence to believe that. Exactly. Yeah. 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 They are perfect partners together for a person. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I imagine that you care also about apologetics. Not like really. I care. Kind of like, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, never mind. The next question is moot. No, just kidding. But what are some things that you would suggest? Like what are your go-tos for apologetics? Yeah. One, just start reading the Bible, honestly. Yeah. Know what it says so that when people challenge you on it, or when you have things that come up that you see. When Satan challenges you on it, because he knows it too. Because he knows it too. Yeah. Like that's the number one thing. You gotta be squared away in the Bible. Yeah. Come on, what are we doing here? Then I have 3 books that I'm a big fan of that have really kind of helped me. First is Mere Christianity. Yeah. C.S. Lewis. That's like the That's the big one.
Yeah.
The second one is The Reason for God by Tim Keller.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Love that one. That goes a lot into the classic, which is also Mere Christianity. Both are kind of classic apologetics. The philosophical ideas. That one's great because the first half of it is all like arguments against Christianity, and he takes time kind of like saying like how none of these arguments really hold water. And then the second half of it is all like the pro-Christianity argument. So it's like, what are the things against Christianity? What are the things for it? Why do these things not make sense? And why do these things make sense? And then the third one, which I use kind of more as a reference book, and it goes a lot more into the evidential apologetics, is Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Which, why am I blanking on the name of?
Josh McDowell and his
Yep.
son Sean. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Which was awesome. And that was like a big one for like, why can we have faith in, or why can we have confidence in the reliability of Scripture, and why can we have confidence in the resurrection? I know there's a ton more, and I see you got a list there too. So which ones did you go to?
Yeah, so Mere Christianity was my top one. That's one that after I got saved, someone recommended that to me, and I started reading it, and boy, did that firm up the foundations. I love Mere Christianity. The Case for Christ was a big one for me too, because again, so for those of you that don't know, Lee Strobel was an investigative journalist, and his wife got saved, and he's like, I didn't sign up for this, so I'm going to show her why Christianity is false. So then he goes in and he's like, okay, what are the big things that Christians believe? Well, okay, like it seems like if the resurrection didn't happen, it seems like none of it makes sense at all. So let's attack that. And then he goes into research it, and he finds all this evidence, and he goes through like the investigative process, and he talks about those different things, even just referring to different homicide cases that he's studied, that he's been a journalist on. And so this is this process that you would take in this case, this kind of thing. So I took that process and applied it to Christianity. And at the end of it, he realizes, no, this happened. Yeah, this really happened. And he gets saved. Yeah. And now he has tons and tons of resources. I mean, he's got the Case for Christ, Case for Creator, Case for Faith, Case for, all these different things. Totally worth looking into. I love it. I also, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Frank Turek. It's so sciencey, it's so heavy, but it's amazing. It's Frank Turek and one other guy, but I can only remember Frank Turek.
Yeah, I love watching Frank Turek videos on YouTube.
Yeah, he's great because, so those are other things, right?
Yeah.
So we've talked about books, but there's people that are on YouTube as well.
Yeah, I love Frank Turek. Red Pen Logic. Have you watched his stuff? He has really short videos where he's like responding to like TikToks pretty much.
Oh, sure.
But he'll just do like one at a time, and it'll just be like one claim, and he just rips them apart, like very humbly and very gently, and like a very loving way. Yeah. It's like kind of crazy how gentle he is, but he just demolishes their arguments. He's great. Yeah, there's what's the one guy's name? The Scottish guy.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
Or Irish maybe. He's got such a great. He's got one against Richard Dawkins.
Yeah,
that is like one of my all-time favorite lines.
So just look up the Scottish guy against Richard Dawkins.
Oh man, why is this is gonna bother me? I'll just talk about a few more books though, while I'm thinking about it. One that kind of reminds me of The Case for Christianity, but from a different perspective, is Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus by Nabil Qureshi, which is like, it's not a going from atheism to Christianity, but going from Islam to Christianity, where it was a very similar thing where he set out to prove Islam over Christianity, ended up becoming a Christian. So that's a good one too.
Yeah. There's another one by Josh and Sean McDowell called, I think it's 77 Crucial Questions. And it tackles all of these hard, like, well, if there's a God, why is there evil in the world? Or like all those different difficult questions. That's another one that's worth it. There's a lot of ministries out there that help, YouTube, podcasts, those kinds of things. William Lane Craig is one of those. He talks through a lot of different things and goes through the science of stuff. He debates all the time. There's just Got Questions is a pretty decent website that kind of helps people. There's lots of different questions. Bible Thinker, who you've heard mentioned a number of times on this podcast, Mike Winger. He just answers questions that just come up on X. formerly Twitter. Do you have to keep saying that anymore? I don't know. Formerly Twitter, it's X. Yeah.
People still know it as Twitter, I think.
Yeah. So he answers usually 10 questions a week. He used to be 20, but he's just too thorough. So that's another great one I'd highly recommend. Cross-Examined.
Yeah.
That's a Frank Turek thing again, but Cross-Examined is a great website. They have an app too that walks you through some stuff.
John Lennox. There it is. I knew it was John something.
Yep.
There we go.
We did it.
That was if you're watching and you see me on my phone, that's what I was doing. I was frantically trying to figure out what his name was.
Scott, what did you type in? Be honest.
I typed in I typed in his line that he used against Richard Dawkins, which is what we call those idols, where he's like, because from Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, he makes the case that if we're asking if God created the world, then we have to ask the question, who created God? And his response is, the Christian worldview is not that we have a created God, it's that we have an uncreated creator. The Christian worldview also has a name for created gods. We call those idols.
Sassy. I like it.
I was like, yes, come on, John.
Get him. Anyways. That's not the point of apologetics, is to win arguments necessarily.
No, but there's some great one-liners out there. Fantastic.
It is good. Yeah, so those are some things that we'd recommend. I'm sure there's more. Hey, if you're listening or watching this on YouTube, maybe put more in the comments. Things, if we missed anything, put more. I'd love to learn more.
Absolutely. What would have been some of the most helpful resources for you? Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Looking ahead at this series as we're kind of wrapping up this first episode, what are some of the topics that we can expect to discuss? Yeah,
so it is an 8-week podcast series. So, of course, today we were talking about what is it, why is it important, and I feel like adrenaline pumping through me. I'm just so excited about it right now. And I hope you are too. So the first one is just, does God exist? So that's going to be our next episode. And so, how do we know that God exists at all is kind of what we're going to be talking about. The next one will be the reliability of Scripture. Can the Bible that we have today really be trusted? I mean, we kind of hinge quite a bit on it. Is it reliable? We'll talk about that. Historical Jesus, part 1. Who is this man that claimed that he was the Son of God? And so we'll be talking about that a little bit. Historical Jesus part 2, we'll be talking about the resurrection. Did he really resurrect from the dead? And we'll have Lee Strobel. No, I'm just kidding. That'd be so cool though, right? If we had Lee Strobel. Anyways, then the next one, why does God allow suffering? Just a common classic question that comes out in the world. And so we'll be talking about that. Faith and science, are they in conflict? That's the next episode. And so, does a deep understanding of science actually lead us away from faith in God? We'll be talking about that. And then just the uniqueness of Christianity as the last episode. And do all religions point to God? Or how is Christianity different from these, quote, world religions? So do you have anything you want to add to that? Or, please not episodes, but any other comments on those different things?
No, I'm so pumped for this. Yeah. I think it's going to be so much fun. I think it's going to be, just really interesting conversations. I love the does God exist question. That's going to be the first one. That's the one that we have to start with, right?
No joke.
Is like, that's kind of the hinge point of all of this. And then also the reliability of Scripture. Love that topic. Yeah. And then, all of them sound great. I wish we could do more. But also, I think this is going to be a great series to share with your friends, to discuss, to add questions. This is a big one for if you have questions on these topics, please send them in. Or if you have pushbacks or counter arguments or something like that, something that we missed. One thing I'm really hoping to do with this series is to try our best to look at it objectively and ask these questions objectively and not straw man the other side of the arguments, but steel man the other side of the arguments. Like, what are the best arguments against the existence of God, right? What can we expect from those arguments and not discredit those arguments, but look at them in good faith.
Yeah. I think the key to any successful debate, maybe there's a different word, is actually taking a real serious look at the opposing side's views and kind of, this is why I understand that you got there. I get it. I get that part. But here is some evidence that you might consider. One, I think that's also the loving way to do it too. But yeah, I'm excited. Please share this. Please, if you need to reference it again or something like that later, hopefully it'll be helpful like that, to where you can go back and, I'm struggling with something. I thought Jesse said something really wise back, 10 weeks ago that I'd like to.
Yeah. Or he said something really dumb and it really made me question a lot of things.
Yeah. Either
Hopefully
one of
that's
those.
Not the case.
Yeah. If it's that, just don't listen again.
Just take it off your feed.
Yeah. But anyways, I'm really excited. I hope you are too. Please send in questions.
Yeah.
Send in thoughts. Send in, hey, this is another resource I use. Send in all that kind of stuff. Let's be a community here, not just Jesse and I, and oftentimes Brent talking on the podcast. So yeah.
Or even if you have questions that you feel like you have a solid answer to, but you've heard a lot of people ask. That's a big thing too. Like, you don't have to just be asking for yourself. We won't judge you if you send in a question that we're like, how'd you not know that answer?
We will not say that.
Yeah, we'll take them all very, very seriously.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. I hope you guys are too. I think that's all we got for today's episode. It was a fun little get the toes in the water and test it out. I think we're gonna have a lot of fun. But yeah, thanks for joining us. Please send in your questions to podcast@hometownchurch.com.
Or encouragements.
Or
Gifts.
discouragements.
No, not those. Don't send those.
Yeah, you can just tell us how much you don't like us, how annoying my voice is. All of those things are very welcome. But yeah, we'll catch you next week with the next episode of, we don't really have a title for this series, Apologetics, Part 2.
Yeah. All right. See you guys.
See ya.
Wow.